What's up guys, my name is Ace, and welcome to my Team Deathmatch Spawn Guide. In this video, I'm going to be sharing all of the common spawn locations on every single one of the maps, as well as how the spawns behave in Call of Duty World War II for Team Deathmatch. Now before we get all the comments saying that the spawns don't work, or the spawns don't have any logic, or the spawns are completely random and you can't predict them in this game, this is completely false. The spawns in this game follow a set of rules. It is a program after all, so it follows a set of rules that we're going to be going over today. And if anybody tells you that the spawns aren't predictable in Team Deathmatch, they don't know what they're talking about. They absolutely are predictable, and it's one of the most important tools for higher level play in this game. Now that's not to say that there aren't some situations where you get a really weird spawn that doesn't seem to make much sense. Of course, those do happen from time to time, but the vast majority of spawns for Team Deathmatch are very predictable in this game. So first up, let's go over the important factors that influence spawns in Team Deathmatch for this game, and then afterwards we'll go into each map in detail and we'll have a look at all the spawn points and how to predict the spawns on each one of these maps. So when we're looking at the spawn logic, there's actually 6 key factors that affect how the spawns behave, and I'm going to be sharing these with you in order. And the order definitely matters when we're talking about this, because they have different weights attached to them, and a lot of these weights are actually taken directly from the in-game code. Keep in mind though, these 6 factors aren't the only factors that have an influence over spawns, it's just the main ones that we want to be focusing on. Also, just know that these aren't strict rules. These are simply factors that influence spawns. There will be some situations where it will go against this logic because there simply wasn't a better spawn available. Keep in mind with Call of Duty, when you hit that respawn button, the game is going to spawn you somewhere instantly. There's no option where it comes up and says, oh, if there's no safe spawn available, just hang on a second, we'll get one for you. When you hit respawn, it has to spawn you somewhere, and therefore sometimes it will go against some of these factors. So the first factor, and the factor that's weighted the heaviest, is line of sight. In this game, you should very rarely ever spawn directly in an enemy's line of sight, or have an enemy spawn directly in your line of sight in Team Deathmatch. Free-for-all is definitely a different story in this game, but in Team Deathmatch at least, those should be extremely rare. And these are those 3 in 1,000 spawns that Michael Condrey was referring to that has kind of become a meme in the community. This doesn't account for the situations where an enemy spawns behind a rock or something, takes 2 steps out, and is now in your line of sight. This is literally enemies popping up in your line of sight when you're aiming at them, or vice versa when you pop up literally in their line of sight. The second most important factor for influencing spawns in Team Deathmatch is the game will try to avoid enemy spawn locations within a 25-meter radius for 6 seconds. What this means is if you spawn in a particular spawn point, let's just say on our den forest, I spawn right here. For the next 6 seconds, it's very, very unlikely that you will ever have an enemy spawn within a 25-meter radius of this spawn point. Of course, there will be some very rare exceptions, but this is one of the most heavily weighted factors when it comes to Team Deathmatch. The next factor is something that actually varies on a couple of the maps in the game, and we'll be going into that when we go through the maps towards the end of the video here. But with this one, you have a claimed spawn area. So the area that you and your teammates have been spawning at, this is your claimed spawn. And on most of the maps, the game is going to try to spawn you in one of these points as long as it doesn't conflict with the first 2 factors. This is the value they're able to tweak that essentially determines how easy it is to flip spawns on a particular map. The higher this value is, the harder it's going to be to flip spawns. An example of this is Flak Tower. This value is actually a little bit higher on Flak Tower, and that means you can get right up in towards the enemy spawn, and it's going to be a lot harder to flip because that's their claimed spawn. Our den forest, on the other hand, is tweaked in the opposite direction to make it a bit easier to flip now because it was having that issue of people getting locked into spawns way too easy before. Moving on to the fourth factor, this is avoiding enemies. And the radius they have set for this is 66 meters in this game, which is actually quite large. What this essentially means is every player is walking around the map with a 66-meter bubble of their influence on the enemy spawn. If they get within 66 meters of an enemy spawn point, that's going to start having an influence over that spawn point. It might not necessarily flip it immediately because this will be overridden by the previous factors we've already talked about, which are weighted more heavily. But if you're putting pressure on an enemy spawn, so you're within 66 meters of an enemy spawn, and there's another safe spawn available for them, this often means that you're going to push that spawn over to the other area. And this is where we're going to get into primary and secondary spawns once we start looking at the individual maps. Getting into the fifth factor, this is avoid ally death. This one has a radius of 20 meters and once again lasts for 6 seconds. This one's pretty straightforward. If you have a teammate that dies, it's very likely that any spawn point within 20 meters of them will be blocked off for your team for the next 6 seconds. And this is designed to prevent those situations where everybody just keeps spawning at the exact same spawn point over and over and over again. You just keep running out, getting killed, running out, getting killed. This is to prevent those situations. Keep in mind though, this isn't weighted nearly as heavy as the previous factors we talked about, and therefore it's more so just something to kind of keep in the back of your head, but it's not nearly as important as the other factors. And this leads us to the final factor we're going to be talking about today, and this is prefer ally. This is the factor that anchors spawns for your team. This one is quite weak and has an 18-meter radius. What this means is the game is going to try to spawn you within 18 meters of a friendly player on the map, but it first must go through all of the other factors we've already talked about, and therefore it only applies to some very specific situations for Team Deathmatch. A quick example of this is here on Aachen. Let's just say that our standard spawn is these two spawns at the back of the map on the top left as you're looking at it now. As your entire team gets pushed up on the map, if nobody is pulled all the way back towards those spawns, it will anchor your spawn point up on the map a little bit so you don't spawn all the way at the back. You're now spawning just slightly forward to get you into the fight a bit faster. Generally, this doesn't have much of an impact on predicting enemy spawns because at that point, if you're on the opposite team, you're not so much worried about predicting where the enemies are spawning because you're the one that's pushed back into your own spawn. So just know that this does exist, and if you do end up spawning pushed up on a map like this often means that you're just being anchored by your teammates. And that's going to cover it for the 6 most important factors that influence spawns for Team Deathmatch in this game. Now let's start getting into the individual maps. We're going to have a look at all of the spawn points that I was able to find, as well as break it down a little bit and how I actually view the spawns to help me predict them a little bit easier. Keep in mind, with each one of these maps, I analyzed hundreds of spawns. These were all the spawn points I found, but it is not going to be a 100% comprehensive list of every single spawn point that's possible on a map. Just know that these are the spawns you're going to be seeing at least like 95% of the time. Any other spawn point that I don't show here is going to be so rare that it's not even really worth mentioning. I'm going to start off kind of slow with this and maybe go over a couple examples, and then we're going to speed it up because you'll kind of get the idea and you just want to see the spawn zones and the spawn points. So first up, we have St. Marie du Mont. Here are all the spawns I was able to find on this map. As you can see here, and this is a trend we'll be seeing with basically all of the linear maps in this game, which is most of the maps, there aren't any spawn points towards the middle of the map. It's always going to be one side of the map and another side of the map, and there's going to be spawn points scattered on both of those sides. Now, when I'm actually predicting spawns in-game, I'm not thinking of the exact spawn point that an enemy is spawning at. It's more so the general area where they're going to be spawning. That's all that really counts. So to simplify things a little bit in my head and make it much easier to predict, I broke it down into zones. These right here are your primary spawn zones. Basically, when there's no pressure put on either one of the spawns, basically all the fighting's just going on towards the middle of the map, these are your standard spawn zones, and this is kind of those business as usual spawns. Now in orange, we have the secondary spawns. These are the spawns that are actually very important when it comes to predicting where enemies are, as well as predicting where enemies are going to be spawning. These are the spawns that tend to occur when it's not business as usual and somebody's putting pressure on spawns somewhere. And this will give us a lot of information about what's going on the map. So just as an example right here, we have one of the teams spawning on the right-hand side, the primary spawns, but as an enemy player pushes up towards this area here where the arrow is, they're starting to put pressure on those spawns. That's that bubble we talked about earlier, and it's actually the same example here, the same situation on St. Marie du Mont. What this is going to do, it's going to put pressure on those primary spawns, which is going to force those spawns over to the barn area on the bottom right. This gives information to both teams. If you're the one that's pushing in on that top side of the map, you know that you're going to be putting pressure on the primary spawns, and now you're going to be forcing the enemy spawns over towards the barn, as long as those are safe spawns, of course. What this means is as you're attacking and pushing through, you know where to look for those enemies. As you kill them, you know where they're going to be coming from after you kill them. On the flip side of that, if you're playing on that side of the map and you notice that teammates are starting to spawn in the barn, or you spawn in the barn, that will give you an indication that there is definitely an enemy that's pushed up towards the other side of the map. This is extremely important on both sides of it, and a lot of people often forget that. They're usually thinking about how to predict enemy spawns, but they're not thinking about what their spawns are telling them about the enemy players and where they're positioned. So always pay attention to both sides of it. Just as a flip example here, if you're starting to push the bottom side of the map, or the B domination side, and they're pushing up towards barns, that will also force that primary spawn, but now it'll force it to the top right side of the map here, and again, it'll give you that same sort of information on both teams. So this is why we really want to be paying close attention when we notice a secondary spawn occur, or when we're putting pressure on an enemy primary spawn. It's always nice to know where those secondary spawns are, and where you're likely to be pushing their spawn points to. The next map we're going to be having a look at is a little bit unique because it's just so narrow. This is USS Texas. As you can see here, it's pretty standard. We've got a bunch of spawn points. Once again, there's none in the middle of the map. They're on either end of the map, and they look pretty scattered, but there's a little bit of information we can gain from the spawns on this map. Based on my analysis of these spawns, it seems like there's actually 2 zones per side. There's the green zone, which once again, these are your primary spawns, kind of business as usual sort of spawns. And then there's the yellow zones. These ones are anchored up on the map a little bit. And what these yellow spawns will tell you, if you end up spawning at one of the yellow spawns, so you don't spawn right at the back, you spawn forward a bit, this will actually tell you that there are no enemies on your half of the ship. If, however, even just one enemy player pushes up to your half of the ship, it's going to force your spawns towards the back side of the ship, and therefore this can give you a lot of information. When you first spawn in on USS Texas, if you spawn right at the back of your ship, that means there's almost definitely an enemy player pushed up on your half of the ship. If, however, you get anchored forward, this means that all of the enemy players are pushed onto their half of the ship, and therefore you don't have to be quite as cautious when you immediately come off of spawn. Getting into Aachen, this is where we're going to start picking up the pace as we go through these maps here. These are all the spawn points I was able to find on Aachen, and as you can tell, it's pretty straightforward here. Again, no spawns towards the middle of the map, and basically the most common zones you're going to be spawning at are simply the 4 corners of the map. It didn't really seem like any of these corners had a heavier weighting than the other corners. It really just depends on the positioning of everybody on the map. So just know if you have, let's just say, the left side of the map as you're looking at it right now, the enemies are most likely either going to be spawning on the top right side or the bottom right side as you're looking at the map right now. And it kind of depends on how much pressure you're putting in which areas of the map. Moving on to Ardennes Forest, you'll see immediately right here, there's a bit of an issue with the spawn points on this map, and this is actually something that caused a lot of problems with the spawns on Ardennes Forest. As you can see, the spawns aren't distributed very well. The left side of the map has significantly more spawns to spawn at than the right side, and this can lead to a lot of really bad spawn traps. When we separate it into the zones, we've got the primary spawns on the left side as well as the right side. No surprises there, but on the left side of the map, you have more relief areas or secondary spawn zones if the enemies start spawn trapping or putting too much pressure on the primary spawns. Whereas on the right-hand side of the map, you don't have that same relief. You do have those cave spawns, which are relatively rare, but for the most part, it's pretty easy to spawn trap people on the right side of the map, or at least it was. They actually tweaked a value here. This is that value I mentioned earlier. It's the preferred claim spawn value. They reduced this significantly, which makes the spawns on this map the easiest to flip in the entire game. That's not to say that you still can't spawn trap in some situations. You can kind of get that A spawn trap going a little bit, but it is significantly harder to hold that spawn trap for a longer period of time, which is a great thing in my mind. Moving on to Flak Tower, no surprises here. It's quite a small map, but it's also quite a symmetrical map, so it makes it really simple when it comes to spawns. As you can see here, we have the standard primary spawn zones, and then we have those secondary spawn zones, which are quite rare on this map. Once again, just like with Ardennes Forest, the preferred claimed spawn value is different than the default value. The default value is 1.25. On Flak Tower, it's 1.5. And this means that the spawns are going to be harder to flip on this map. And you guys have probably noticed this if you played TDM on this map. You can push pretty much right into the enemy spawn, and they will often still spawn there. So it's much harder to flip, and that's the most important thing to know with Flak Tower. Getting into Gibraltar, once again, not too many surprises here. You've got the standard primary spawns on either end of the map with a couple different secondary spawn for each side of the map, and they're in pretty predictable places as well. Although I will say that the secondary spawns are quite rare on this map for Team Deathmatch just because the primary spawn zones are so large and there's so many spawn points within those zones. So with Gibraltar, you normally won't see those secondary spawns for Team Deathmatch. It's usually just going to be they're spawning on one end of the map or the other. It's extremely straightforward. Moving on to Gustav Cannon. Once again, no spawns towards the middle of the map, and you've basically got 4 different zones in each of the corners of the map. What I was able to determine based on all of my analysis of the spawns is the primary spawns appear to be either the barn side or the farmhouse side, so the top right and the bottom left as you're looking at it now. The windmill as well as the church spawns, which are the secondary spawns here, these ones usually only seem to happen when there's pressure put on the primary spawns. So normally what this means is if you find yourself spawning at church and you were previously spawning at farmhouse, this usually means that an enemy player has pushed up into the general vicinity of the farmhouse area. On the flip side of that, if you start spawning on the windmill and you were previously spawning at barn, that usually means you've got an enemy player that's putting pressure on those barn spawns. Moving on to London Docks, once again, same story, no spawns towards the middle of the map. It's pretty easy to predict these spawns as well. If you start putting pressure on either side of the map, you'll easily force over to those secondary spawn zones, and really there's not too much out of the ordinary when it comes to these spawns. And finally, this brings us to Point du Hoc, and this is kind of an outlier. This one doesn't behave like the other maps in the game because it has a circular flow. Most of the other maps are extremely linear and really easy to predict, whereas Point du Hoc is basically like a circle, and there are spawn points spread all the way around the edges of this circle. This one definitely took the most amount of time to really learn how the spawns work, and it is the most difficult, in my opinion at least, to predict spawns on. These are the different spawn zones I was able to determine based on a bunch of analysis of these spawns. Pay close attention to where the primary spawns are in relation to the secondary spawns. Those secondary spawns are going to be relatively rare, you don't have to worry about them too much. Focus mainly on the green areas, and also just know that normally the two teams will be spawning on the opposite primary spawn. So if you see where your teammates are spawning, or you know where you are spawning, that will give you a very good indication of where the enemy team is spawning. If you spawn farmhouse, for instance, that means they're almost definitely going to be spawning on this spawn zone right up here. On the flip side of that, if you spawn on the right-hand side of the map as you're looking at it right now, that almost definitely means the enemies are going to be spawning in this area over here. This one definitely takes some getting used to, and it is very difficult to predict. And just to add to the complexity a little bit, this map also has a slight tweak to the prefer claim spawn. Like I said, the default is 1.25. With Point du Hoc, it is 1. And what this means is spawns are just a little bit easier to flip on this map compared to all of the other maps aside from Ardennes Forest. And with that, we're going to wrap up the Team Deathmatch spawn guide for CoD World War II. I really hope you guys were able to pick something up from this and gain a little bit more insight as to how the spawns actually work in Team Deathmatch for this game. I am planning on covering a few of the other game modes in this game, obviously not every single one of the game modes, but some of the more common ones like Domination, for instance, possibly Hardpoint, although I might just focus on competitive maps and competitive rule sets for that. But I'd like to know in the comment section below. First off, what did you think of this spawn guide and the fact that I included every single map in here rather than what I've done in the past where I do individual maps per episode? And which game mode would you like me to cover next for this series? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.